Okay, so in this video, I just want to briefly go through some of the major points of Chapter 3 that I want you to know. You can also look on your study guide and use the textbook to fill in some details. Okay, so things I want you to think about as we talk about environmental policy is think about why it's difficult to make policy changes. We talked a little bit about this with climate change. But think of what kind of issues there are, economics versus environmental, how politics gets involved, how border issues, either between states or between countries, can play a role. And we'll come back to this, but think of that idea of tragedy of the commons, because I think that's really pertinent here. Okay? All right, so if we look, here is a view. This is the Pacific coast. And notice this brown area here. That's a wastewater plume in the Pacific Ocean near Tijuana. So if we look at Tijuana, you can see that it's right near the border between the U.S. and Mexico. And this is the watershed for the Tijuana River. And this population has been growing exponentially. And basically the wastewater that's produced here, especially during heavy rains, overwhelms the wastewater treatment system, and notice how the river ends here. And so all of that pollution basically travels up into San Diego Bay, the beaches. So this is a cross-border problem. And the only way that this can really be solved is if both countries work together. And in fact, the U.S. actually negotiated a treaty and they helped build a better wastewater treatment facility because this was affecting the U.S., and Mexico didn't really have the money to upgrade by itself. Unfortunately, the population has continued to grow in this area, so even that wastewater treatment plant is really not functioning as efficiently as it should. Okay. Another example of environmental policy is that which surrounds hydraulic fracturing or fracking. So hydraulic fracturing is basically when you drill down into shale rock formations, and they pump basically water and sand and various other chemicals, and the fractures that they're created within the rock release natural gas that they can then take up and store. So hydraulic fracturing has really been booming in certain areas of this country. The benefits are, we've been able to really increase our natural gas production, so we don't rely as heavily on foreign countries. The employment in those areas has been increased, so it provides lots of employment and lots of economic benefits in those areas in particular. It's driven down the cost of natural gas. But what are the environmental costs? So there's lots of chemicals that are present in this water, and the water is basically pumped down and then it comes back up and is either stored or released. And so there's been issues with air pollution, with water pollution. People that live in these areas have actually had methane that's pretty much invaded their well water. So you sometimes see that person turning on the faucet and it catching on fire, which is never a good thing. There have also been like small earthquakes that are triggered in parts of the country. So you'll notice here Maryland has banned fracking. But you can see these are the regions where fracking has a lot of potential. So here we are up here, and this is the Marcellus Shale. So us, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, that's where we're doing or potentially doing fracking. And if you look, here's a map of the country. So all of these sort of gold areas are areas where fracking is active. And there's especially a ton in this Oklahoma region. So there's a lot of fracking going on there. In the Northeast, you can see more of this red areas. So these are states that have banned fracking or currently have moratoria on fracking. So these are areas where either the politics or the economics or some combination has made it more feasible to ban. All right, so how does this environmental policy get set? So environmental policy is anything that pertains to our interactions with the environment, and its goal is fairness and resource use that works and is sustainable. So think about some issues here. So one thing I want you to think about are free riders. So free riders are basically, if we think back of our tragedy of the commons. So your group created rules on fishing and how many fish everybody could take, and that worked, and your pond then could sustain a population of fish. What if you had somebody come in, I don't know, at night, and they were going to fish, and they weren't going to pay any attention to your rules, but you didn't know they were there. So they're a free rider. They're taking advantage of the environmental policy you set up, but they're not paying any of the price, and they're probably making a profit off it. If there's too many free riders, then that can obviously cause a lot of problems. I mean, your fish are going to start to be depleted. So free riders is basically creating a market failure, and it occurs when people are benefiting from resources, goods, or services that they do not pay for. Okay. Another issue is this idea of external cost. So external costs are costs that are borne outside of sort of the supply and demand. So they're not borne by the company or the people that are buying the product necessarily, but it's sort of like a downriver problem. So the example here would be an industrial plant. So it has to think about cost for how much does it cost to produce, let's say, this dye that I'm producing. How much are my workers' benefits going to cost me? What types of working environment do I have to provide? What price should I set on it? Those are all things companies think about. They don't think about, well, what if there's pollution and it gets into the stream and it's carried 20 miles away and pollutes the well water of that community? Right? It's really hard to pin that cost on the original polluter. So those are external costs. And those are usually taken up by society. So society has to, we pay taxes a lot of times to deal with these external costs. All right, so who makes environmental policy? Well, environmental policy, you probably learned this in government, but laws are made in the legislative branch. So environmental laws are made here. And then the executive branch actually enforces and interprets the laws. Okay, and they do this through this variety of administrative agencies. All right, and so things like the EPA, which is in the news a lot, they will look at the Clean Air or the Clean Water Act, and they'll be like, okay, these are how we're going to set the regulations. This is how we're going to enforce it. And sometimes, maybe an environmental group will go, no, we don't agree with that. We don't think you're interpreting that correctly. So they will sue. And then the problem moves to the judiciary. So the courts then decide, is their interpretation in line with what Congress meant? And is it in line with what the Constitution allows? So is it constitutional? So all of those things play a role in policy. And here's a list of all these administrative agencies that sometimes we forget that they're part of the executive branch. And a lot of these, if you read through it, are concerned with various environmental issues. And so we'll talk about these as the year goes on. All right. What is the history of environmental policy? Well, if you think back to, when the country first started, the environmental policy was basically move west, start farming, start mining. There's all these resources. We need to take advantage of them. So things like the Homestead Act in 1862 really encouraged people to move and start farming land. So it made land easy to get and fairly cheap. The second wave, so late 1800s, early 1900s, now we're trying to mitigate some of the environmental problems that are associated with westward expansion. So people are looking around and all of a sudden realizing, wait, we are losing our pristine forest. We're losing some of these natural resources. We need to do something to protect them. So in 1872, Yellowstone was created as the world's first national park. 1903, Roosevelt created the first national wildlife refuge. And shortly thereafter, the national park system, national forest system, and various other land management policies really came into being. All right, the third wave, 1960s, 1970s, this was a response largely to pollution. So after World War II, economy's booming, lots of chemicals, lots of pesticides, plastics, dyes, lots of things like that. But they're actually things people can see and respond to. And Rachel Carson was really responsible for bringing a lot of this to public attention. So she wrote Silent Spring in 1962. And it dealt primarily with the problem of pollution from pesticides, in particular DDT. And we'll talk about DDT later on in the course, but it's basically a persistent pesticide that was later shown to make the shells in birds' eggs thinner. So it impacted the survival of various types of songbirds especially. So that was Silent Spring. Here's a picture of another one of my favorites. This is the Cuyahoga River. And the Cuyahoga River was so polluted, it would catch fire. The river would catch fire for days. So it caught fire several times in the 1950s and 60s. So again, this was kind of obvious to people that there was pollution there and they should do something. Right? This was also a time where there's lots of activism going on, civil rights movement, women's rights movement, and so the environmental rights movement was sort of born in the same time frame. So the first Earth Day was marked in April 22nd, 1970, right? And Richard Nixon, who was a Republican president, was really pressured to then enact various environmental policies. So he signed the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, into law on January 1st, 1970, and later basically created the EPA, which was basically moving various elements of agencies that regulated water quality, air pollution, solid waste, and other issues. So sorry for the sirens. That's outside the school right now. And basically the EPA is what's in the news a lot when you're talking about regulating various environmental laws. Okay, I apologize. Hopefully you can hear me again. And here are some of the key environmental protection laws, 1963 to 1985. Notice there's a lot at the beginning, not so much towards more recent times. Okay. The other thing we want to think of is, okay, not just the U.S., but environmental international policy. Okay. So this is where we're going back to that cross-border cooperation that's necessary. And also think about that tragedy of the commons. Right? When we pollute the air or the water, it's not just where the pollution happens, right? The atmosphere encircles the whole world. So pollution really is a worldwide issue, but that's problematic because how do you get all these different countries to agree? So cross-border cooperation is done through a combination of conventional and customary law. So conventional law is, think of all those meetings. So the Montreal Protocol, the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Treaty, treaties and protocols that are agreed upon and signed by various countries in a sort of formal atmosphere. Okay. Some of the agencies that are involved with this are the United Nations. So that's active in making international environmental policies. The World Trade Organization. So this is something, again, that's in the news a lot, is do these trade agreements that we're making also take into account environmental problems, right? Every country has different environmental regulations. So how do you regulate trade between them? Which regulations are more important? Okay. The World Bank. The World Bank funds a lot of different sort of areas, especially in developing countries. What do they choose to fund? That can have environmental impacts. And then there are a lot of non-governmental organizations or NGOs. All right, so this is things like the Nature Conservancy, which is probably one of the most well-known. And they spend a lot of money buying up areas of land to set aside for preservation. Worldwide Fund for Nature is one. Greenpeace is one of the more controversial NGOs that you've probably heard about. Okay, so what I want to leave you with, though, is this thought when we think about trade barriers in particular, but international. If Nation A has stricter laws for environmental protection than Nation B, and if these laws restrict the ability of Nation B to export its goods to Nation A, then by the policy of the WTO and the EU, the European Union, Nation A's environmental protection laws could be overruled in the name of free trade. Do you think this is right? Okay, so think about those things. All right, I